Alright, so we need to open up Microsoft Excel. Just open up a blank document. And our first step is to get our data from the highway mileage versus car weight example into Excel. Now, really all we need to put in is the numbers, but I always suggest some headings and units and all that is a good thing to put in, just so when you refer back to this later, you know what you're talking about. So I'm going to suggest we make a column called model. We can shorten it to just the model. Weight in pounds. And notice here how when you type in weight in pounds, it runs through into column C. If you want to auto correct the width of a column, if you go up here between B and C and double click, it will automatically resize the column, so that's a useful thing to know. Column C, let's put in highway mileage in miles per gallon. Now, I'm going to go ahead and make my font size bigger so you guys can see it on the screen, but you don't necessarily have to do that. And then we just want to go through and start putting in the values for each of these. So I'm going to pause this while we get those in. Again. Alright, so we've got our data in. At the top of the screen you can see kind of zoomed in where I am on the screen. Hopefully that's not too confusing, but that'll help us locate some of the icons that we need. So we would like to click and drag over the numbers that we're interested in graphing. Okay. And we want to insert a chart. We want to make a graph of this data. So once you've highlighted that, go Insert, and the type of graph that we want is right here. It's called an XY scatter. And once we click on that, we get some various options. We want the first one here, upper left. And it's going to even give us a preview on the screen once we do that. So we click on it, and it creates a chart here. Okay. So that gives us kind of a first impression of the data. And our next step is to look at that and try to determine what sort of relationship type we have. If we're lucky, it's linear, because linear relationships are the easiest to analyze. If it's not, if it's some sort of curve, our first step is to try to identify which type we have. So we want to refer to the note sheet, graphical data analysis, that table, and see if we can pick, if we had to guess, which type of graph shape we see here. And again, I'm going to pause it, and we'll talk about it. So we have determined that this is an inverse relationship, which means we need to plot what I'm going to call a linearized graph. We're going to take this data set that we had and modify it somewhat and create a new graph that will allow us to check whether it is in fact an inverse relationship, and it will help us come up with an equation that describes this curve that we're seeing here. So we're kind of assuming that the curve kind of trends down through the data in this sort of direction. Okay. Now, a couple things we can do just to clean up the graph before we move on, especially if you're going to put this in a lab report. We want to put some labels on each axis. We want to put a chart title in. So this little plus button will allow us to choose some things. We want axis titles for one thing, so we can click that. And some text boxes come up. And so we can look and make sure that we're plotting what we would expect. So if I look at this x-axis, what's it plotting here? What do these numbers look like? The weights, right? So let's go ahead and label that as weight. We want to put in units, so pounds. And I'll go over to the vertical axis or the y-axis. Whoops. What did I do? I deleted it. There we go. We want this to be highway mileage in miles per gallon. Okay. Now, chart title on that reading sheet, the convention for naming your graphs or your charts would be the y-axis variable versus the x-axis variable. So this is going to be called highway mileage versus weight. Okay. All right. So we've got that graph cleaned up. Our job, we want to find an equation that describes the curve that would run through this data. That's our end goal. Okay. All right, so we've cleaned up the graph a little bit. We need to do this linearization step, which should help us check to see whether or not it is in fact an inverse relationship. So I'm just going to drag this graph down for a moment. And if you look at your note sheet, if you think it's an inverse relationship, the modification to the data that you need to do is to take and calculate the inverse of the x-axis variable. Okay? In this case, that's the weight, our independent variable. So we need to make a new column of data that is titled 1 over weight. And the corresponding units would be 1 over pounds. Okay? And we could go ahead and calculate those values with a calculator and plug them in. Essentially, we want to know what 1 divided by 2060 is. But the nice thing about a spreadsheet is it will do calculations for you if you type in an equal sign. So I just want to type in 1 divided by, and I could type 2060 and hit enter. There's a better way to do it though. I want to reference the cell that that data is in. In other words, I want to reference cell B2. So if I come over here and click, notice how it entered in my formula 1 divided by B2. So it's pulling the data from B2. If I hit enter, it calculates that value. Okay? Show you that again. So I'm typing in equal sign 1 divided by, and I can either type B2 or I can just go over here and click in B2 and hit enter. And it has calculated the value for 1 divided by 2060. Okay? Now I want to do that same thing down the line here. And I want to save myself some time. So I want to fill this same formula, do this same calculation in each row. The simplest way to do that is if you look at the bottom right corner of this cell that already has the formula. If I hover over it, my cursor changes to a crosshair. And if I click and drag that down, it does the calculation right down the line, right? That's going to save me a lot of typing. And it does it all in one step. All right, I'm going to pause.